today we're going to talk about questioning and questioning strategies, the kind of questioning strategies that get the most out of our kids. This topic, questioning, is pretty much ubiquitous in education. Everybody knows about the power of questioning. It's about the oldest instructional technique that we know of. Other than maybe a direct lecture, it's the oldest technique out there. Not too many people would say that questioning is unimportant. Here's what I found, and I'll share a little bit of evidence and background with you as well, is that most of us as educators just kind of make it up as we go. We know questions are important, so maybe we just kind of ask the questions right off the top of our head, or we rely on textbook or curriculum-based questions that come along with the program. I'm going to share with you ideas, ways to think about questioning, as well as some real specific strategies as well. As we begin, I don't know about you, but sometimes weird questions pop up into my mind. I wonder if you ever asked yourself weird, sometimes funky, strange questions like this. These are thanks to comedians like Gallagher and Seinfeld, who ask these kind of questions. Why are they called apartments when they're all stuck together? I know we're asking questions. Sometimes weird questions jump up into our head. Or how about this one? Why does an alarm clock go off when it turns on? The English language is a strange thing. How about this one? Why is abbreviation such a long word? We're talking really. Sometimes questions are just pop into your mind, right? My all-time favorite, why is a carrot more orange than an orange? The color should be called carrot, I think. So I'm gonna, you see the kind of things that go on in my head. And then why are there 5 syllables in the word monosyllabic? Just weird things that pop into our head. Anyway, it's good to laugh and enjoy each other's company as we begin. For those of you who like to see some sort of an agenda, here's what we'll talk about real briefly, why questioning matters and what it gets us. Like I mentioned earlier, not too many people would argue that questioning is unimportant. We all know the importance of it. For those of you who already are really solidly foundationally, you know this questioning stuff, I'll provide a little bit more evidence, especially those of you who want to share these ideas with your staff members. Here's even a little bit more research to back up your ideas that you share with them. I'll share with you 4 key ideas and then specific strategies, and as always, we'll end with some Q&A time if you have any. So let's start with a quick 10,000-foot overview why questioning matters. Not that you necessarily need to be convinced that questioning is important, but here's some more background and evidence for you as you go about sharing and influencing the people in your schools. So some interesting facts about this idea of questioning. In fact, I'll just put all the questions up there. Let's do this. Let's take a moment, lean in, see if you can answer those questions, figure out which words or numbers rather, excuse me, might go into each of the blank lines on the first 3. This should take us about, I don't know, 60 seconds or so. No need to use the chat feature yet, although you certainly can if you'd like. All right, lean in, give it a shot. Ready, set, begin. Let's see how you did. Let's actually start with number 5. Let's switch it up and start with number 5 and then go from bottom to top. Wait time, we'll actually talk about Mary Bud Rowe's original research going all the way back to the 1970s. She found this with when it comes to wait time, when teachers just paused after asking a question. That was the original wait time research. Teacher asks a question and they pause before they call on a student or ask for some sort of response. When they started to pause, even between 3 and 5 seconds, some amazing things happen. What she found when she observed teachers, again, original studies going back to the 70s, is that when she observed teachers, they waited on an average less than 1 second. But when you just bump that up to just 3 to 5 seconds, some amazing things happen, including more students participated, the quality of their answers increased, all kinds of amazing things happen. Number 4, you probably already figured it out. Most of the time when we ask questions, they're rather basic procedural kind of stuff. That's the 80. Only about 20% of our questions in one national study was kind of what you might think of as higher order thinking questions. Number 3 is interesting. Teachers spend between 30, depending on the study you're looking at, between 30 and 50% of their time posing questions. Sometimes they're rhetorical questions like, what should you be doing right now? Where they don't really want an answer from their kids, but it still comes out in question format. Sometimes they're deep questions related to content. Sometimes they're questions related to behavior or procedures, but we spend a lot of time asking questions, so we ought to be pretty good at it. Number 2, questioning is second only to teacher talk or lecture as the most common strategy in classrooms. And number 1, classroom discussion, and that is when students talk to each other or they talk to the teacher. We spend a lot of time talking about how do we get kids to talk. That will make that connection in this session as well, is we partially use really good questioning techniques to get kids to talk. Because when you talk and when you flesh things out, when you hear yourself explain something, it actually deepens memory and understanding. So the answer to number 1 is 1.7 minutes. The amount of discussion taking place in our classrooms, that citation's a little bit old at this point. I should probably update it, but I haven't seen any research that contradicts it, by the way. We don't get our kids to do a lot of discussion in classrooms. We think we do, but what's actually taking place is very small. It accounts for roughly 3% of the time. So if you're taking notes, that's 1.7% or 1.7 minutes an hour, about 3% of the time. Number 2 is teacher talk. Number 3 is 30 to 50%, 80, 20, and then so on. Let's keep going. Let's take a little bit more look at some of the questioning research. And this was an interesting study cited by Walsh and Satz in a really good book on the concept of questioning. They asked teachers and then they compared what teachers thought to an actual study in classrooms. First question, they asked how many questions, they were asking teachers at this point, how many questions do you think you ask in a 30-minute period? Then they recorded what teachers thought they were asking, and then they actually compared it to the study. They also asked teachers the second question, how many questions do you think students are asking, which is probably even a better barometer of the learning happening in our classroom, are not so much the questions we're asking, but the questions students are asking. See if you can figure out, take a guess, make a prediction. What do you think teachers thought and the study showed in each of those 2 questions? Let me give you about 10 seconds to ponder those questions. And here is what they found. How many questions do you think you ask in a 30-minute period? Teachers thought, oh, maybe about 15. Study showed 50. Why is there such a discrepancy? Because when we think of questioning, they looked at a broad category, including rhetorical questions and including questions about procedures and behavior, not just about content. Most of the time, teachers think questioning, I'm asking them about content. But we know good questioning strategies can work for behavior and content and procedures altogether. We ask a lot of questions. Then they also ask, well, teachers, how many questions do you think students are asking? Teachers are thinking, oh, they're asking a lot of questions, about 10 per 30-minute period. And the study showed it was less than 2. This just opens up our eyes to think about questioning just a little bit. Also from Walsh and Satz, this is what they say, and I really appreciate their perspective about the power of questioning. Take a look. The kind of questions we ask, the nature of the questions we ask, the strategies, the specific strategies we use will be a determining factor in their words, who comes along for the ride. So we ought to be pretty good at it. If you need even more evidence, even more background, we know that when there's strong effect sizes, when we do some good solid questioning. This comes from Hattie. Everybody knows about the importance of Hattie and effect sizes. In fact, it's practically malpractice for a presenter not to quote Hattie, right? And his effect size. And you can see when we use good strategies related to questioning and then ultimately get kids to discuss and dig into ideas and verbalize their understanding of something, we see amazing things happen. Good questioning followed by good elaborative discussions on the part of kids equals better understanding and better learning. So here are 4 big ideas. That's the end of the 10,000 foot overview, just a basic, a little bit of what we know about the power of questioning. 4 characteristics, and then we'll talk strategies as well. We'll dig briefly into each of these 4 characteristics, what I mean by these, and then I'll share with you some easy take-home strategies you can start using right away. Now, these 4 characteristics are ones that I developed a number of years ago. It's not an exhaustive list. It's not necessarily a complete list, nor is it necessarily the only list. But as I've trained teachers on questioning strategies, when we can do these 4 things pretty consistently, we get good results from our kids. So let's jump in. The first one is just to pre-plan our questions. This perhaps is the most important take-home message of our entire session. And that is when we want to ask questions of our kids to get them to deepen content knowledge or self-reflect or improve behavior, we plan them ahead of time. We plan the specific questions ahead of time that we want kids to dig into. This is, by the way, one reason that you'll notice I often, in almost all my sessions, I begin somewhere in the beginning with some sort of partner quiz like we did on those 5 questions where I asked you to fill in the blank. Partially that forces me to be thoughtful about the questions, about the issues, about the ideas I want you to tackle. What I want my audience to tackle is important, so I have to give a lot of time into planning questions. Now, most of us as educators, we spend a lot of time designing activities. Spend a lot of time putting our technology tools together or the other resources or looking through the curriculum. We spend a lot of time designing activities. We don't always put as much time into planning the specific questions we want kids to dig deeply into. So the take-home message is this: if nothing else, just encourage the teachers you support to spend time planning ahead of time those questions. We don't just make them up as we go. This does not mean that we ignore those teachable moments, because in every classroom, and hopefully in a lot of your lessons, a kid will ask a question and it opens up a whole nother avenue that you can enter into. We call those teachable moments. It doesn't ignore teachable moments. It just says, I'm going to be ready for the teachable moments when they come. But if they don't come, I'm going to create the teachable moments through really good pre-planning of questioning. So of the 4 characteristics, characteristic number 1 is just to make sure that we're really paying attention to the specific questions we will be asking kids. And it's easy to differentiate. It's easy to put together for small groups versus students with special needs and so forth. Characteristic number 1, pre-plan. Characteristic number 2 is to focus on questioning rather than quizzing. Now, this comes from Fry and Fisher. If you know that duo, they together have written probably a couple of dozen books at this point on a variety of issues related to the profession. They point this out. In many classrooms, this is what we do. We do what's called quizzing, and it might sound like this. We ask our students, what's a nocturnal animal? The student says an animal that stays awake at night. We say, good, can you name one? They say, sure, bat. That's really what that's doing, is quizzing. It's not digging. Here's the difference. A quiz is rather surface. Do they know kind of the surface correct answer? Questioning, the goal of questioning is to dig, to help uncover or discover understanding. Here's the difference. Questioning, we start with the same one. What's a nocturnal animal? A student says an animal that stays awake at night. Here's where the digging part comes in. And I'm going to show you some other strategies for this as well. Tell me more about that. Any special characteristics? We dig a little bit. Well, it doesn't sleep a lot. If a student says that, I'm like, okay, I have some reteaching to do. See, if I only stay with quizzing, which I'm guilty of sometimes in the classroom, or I was when I was in the classroom with kids, when I stayed at quizzing, I would assume that kid knew the answer, that they had the characteristics of a nocturnal animal pretty set. But it's not until I start digging a little bit more and I ask kids to explain, to elaborate, to uncover, to give examples. It's not until I start digging that I discover, oh, maybe the student doesn't know it as well as I thought. Because if I stay on the left, if I only do lots of quizzing, it can lead me to believe that the kid's ready for the test, or they're ready for the next step, or they're ready to apply. And it's only after I kind of dig into the quizzes, or the questioning, that I can truly discover the depth of their knowledge. So characteristic number 2 is to focus as much on questioning rather than just quizzing. Is quizzing okay sometimes? Sure. What quizzing can do for us, especially when we kind of want to get the sense of our audience, is it can kind of tell, are we on the same page? Are we all talking the same basic ideas? But it's not until I start digging that I truly uncover the depth of a student's ideas or their misconceptions or their understandings. Characteristic number 2, we dig. That's the true nature of questioning, is digging to help uncover or discover understanding. All right, here is characteristic number 3, is to beware of the curse of knowledge, sometimes called the expert blind spot. So here's what it is. In a nutshell, Brian, what the heck is the expert blind spot? The expert blind spot is this. Every single one of us are blind. When you become an expert in something, quote unquote, expert in something. So imagine this. You've been teaching 5th grade for 10 years. Drum roll, please. You're an expert in 5th grade curriculum. You know, not just because you were a 5th grader at one time, but you are an expert in 5th grade. You know 5th grade curriculum backwards and forwards. You know 5th graders backwards and forwards. You know their characteristics. You know what's unique about them. You know 5th graders. You're an expert in 5th graders. The challenge is, because you're an expert in 5th grade curriculum especially, The challenge is that you sometimes can become blind. And that is, let's say you're going to teach a fractions concept to your fifth graders. You've taught that fractions concept perhaps thousands of times to thousands of kids. The blind spot is recognizing and remembering that although I know it well because I'm the expert, this might be the very first time my kid has ever encountered this idea. Let's take school away from it for a second. Let's step out of the school environment. Have you ever interacted with someone who knew something so well and they tried to communicate it to you and they looked at you like you were an idiot, that you didn't understand things to the depth that they understand? Like technology is a great example. You sit down with somebody, they're trying to give you a tutorial on something with the computer, and they're talking about acronyms and they're doing all this other stuff. They're just throwing out ideas to you like, well, of course you know this, right? Everybody knows this. That person is blind. The curse in this case is their knowledge is so in such depth. They have such depth of knowledge that it's easy to forget what it's like to not have that depth of knowledge. What does this have to do with questioning? When we question students, if we don't remember that although they might give us the right answer, the depth might not be there, because they might give it same answer or a similar answer I would have come up with, but the answer I come up with after 10 years of teaching fifth grade is very different than the answer they came up with. And we got there differently. The curse of knowledge is just remembering that I have depth of knowledge in something. And sometimes I go about explaining it, assuming the people around me have a similar depth of knowledge. And that because I explained it, they understood it, or understood it in with enough depth in order to apply it. The takeaway is this: we're all blind. Every single one of us knows something so well, we've sometimes forgotten what it's like to not know it as well as we know it. In fact, it's impossible to not know it as well as you know it. The true art of being a teacher is saying, okay, this person in front of me, they don't have the same depth. They might have given me a similar answer, but my answer was built on 10 years of experience. Their answer was built on 10 minutes. Therefore, we think about it differently. If you're interested and you wanted to know a little bit more about this, I'll show you where to go, but here's a quick summary. Take a look. Excuse me. Characteristic of number 3 of 4 is just to remember that when it comes to questioning, I have to dig, I have to help uncover, because we have very different depths of understanding, even when we come to the same answer. That's an important thing to keep in mind. We're all blind, and that's okay. Just realizing it is the first step. The Expert Blind Spot, the Curse of Knowledge. If you're interested and want to read more, a couple of years ago, I wrote a blog on this, and you can access that blog, that article, in a couple of different ways. You can scan the QR code. If you don't know how to do that, you just get your phone out. If you have a relatively new smartphone, open up the camera, the live camera on your phone, zoom it into that image, that QR code, and it'll open up the web page directly to that. Or you can Google the term teaching, learning, and the curse of knowledge with my name to it, and it should show up. If neither of those work, just send me an email and I'll send you a link to it as well. Characteristic number 3 is that to remember the expert blind spot, the fact that we know something so well, it can actually be a curse sometimes when we're trying to teach it to someone else. And the fourth one is to use very specific, highly effective questioning strategies. In fact, the rest of our session, we're just going to dig into some of them. We're going to dig into some of those questioning strategies and give you time to wrap your head around it. And I've built in time into this session to get feedback from you all to see if you wanted to share some of your favorite questioning strategies as well. So you can keep that in your mind. If you want, at the end, I built in some time where we can just share and learn from each other. What are some of the really good questioning strategies that you've created or utilized over the years? We'll learn from each other as well. When it comes to questioning strategies, specific strategies, as well as specific questions, what effective educators understand is just because the textbook or the curricular program has some questions in there, doesn't mean they're great questions. Doesn't mean those questions are going to relate to the specific kids that you teach. It's okay to use curriculum-based and textbook-based questions as the beginning, as a starting point, but we always customize those. Why is that the case? Well, I'm about to give you a slight insight into curriculum development. Can I do that for a moment? I don't want to sound like I'm beating up on curricular companies, because we need textbook publishing companies. We need companies out there mass producing curriculum. So I'm not trying to beat up on them. But here is essentially what happens quite often. Now, there are some times when a textbook publishing company goes and hires an expert who really knows the research and really knows instruction, and they help design it. But what often happens is they hire for example, let's say a middle school science text. They hire a scientist, one who knows content really well, to help develop some ideas, and then they hand those ideas off to cubicle workers, essentially. I'm simplifying the process, but I think some of you already know this. Cubicle workers are people who then take all of that and then say, okay, well, here's a good question, that should go with that. Here's another good question, that should go with that. They're not people who know your kids. They're not people who are specifically targeting those questions for your audience. They're trying to be mass marketing. They're mass marketing lots of questions, thinking they'll be appealing to as many people as possible. And they're not necessarily doing it based on what is really good higher order thinking questioning. The people who work in those cubicles are often, drum roll please, not even educators. Now, they're not bad people. I know I sound like I'm beating up on the curricular people, but they're not us. We know our kids. We know what our kids need. The takeaway is I need to use specific questioning and specific questioning strategies. In order to get the best out of my kids, I need to customize it. I can't just take off the shelf stuff, because every situation is different. I know I'm preaching to the choir. I get it. I'm preaching to the choir, but I have good strategies coming your way, at least a couple of them in our last half hour here or so. Here are some of the strategies we'll take a look at, and I have a couple bonus ones if we have any time. We'll look into those as well. We'll talk about wait time and partner quizzes and says who, QSpace, analogies. We'll talk about all of those here in the next couple of minutes. So let's jump in. You'll notice the first one, actually, let me go back one slide. The reason there's a partner quiz with an asterisk is most of the sessions, if you've been to several of my other sessions, we begin with some sort of quiz. We begin with a Q&A or like a quiz time. These are ones from previous sessions. The feedback one that we did not too long ago. Last week we were together, we talked about writing. Sometimes they're true false quizzes. Sometimes they're a little bit more in more depth, like agree disagree, like you see there on the left. Sometimes they're fill in the blank. We did one of those to start this session. The reason we do those, a couple of reasons. One is it just gets kids to talk. Now, we can do that in a virtual setting. It's a little bit more difficult, but imagine a typical classroom setting where you pose specific questions you want kids to think about, and doing these kind of partner quizzes also force us to plan the questions ahead of time. And they force kids to just talk and make predictions. When you talk and make predictions and then get pretty immediate feedback, that's wonderful for learning. So going back one of the really effective questioning strategies is to do some sort of partner or small group quiz. These quizzes are also effective because they're low stakes. I did share that with you, I think, in previous sessions as well, meaning I'm not attaching points to them. I'm not attaching anything of consequence other than just engagement. Get them to interact, engage, discuss, think, process, write. That's the purpose of doing some sort of partner quiz, and we do a lot of those. So I love doing these for a couple of reasons. It forces me to pre-plan my questions. It forces me to be thoughtful about engaging students at specific points. And another thing, this actually goes all the way back to one of our very first sessions together. If you don't recall this, or if you weren't with us, why do we do things like partner quizzes? Why are they such wonderful things? Well, this will be a bit of a reminder for some of you who are in that other session, but let me summarize if you weren't in one of our other sessions where I talked about this. If you recall, I'm the brain nerd, right? I've got my brain sitting right, staring at us from the bookshelf. This comes from our understanding of how memory and the brain works. Henry Roediger, he's a brain researcher, he's a neuroscientist. He says this: every time that he teaches coursework, they do at least two things. They take a quiz in order to test their understanding, and then they get feedback. And he said, often the quizzes that we take are verbal, meaning I'm going to flash up some questions. I want you to think about it and then compare your answers to the people around you. It forces you to think, to talk, to reflect, to correct. You get feedback, amazing things happen. In fact, they're better than just lecturing the same amount of material. It's better to put them in quiz form than just telling people the same amount of material. And he says we also write in order to develop understanding. We talked about that last week. And then Dr. Willis, she's interesting because she's both a middle school science, or she's been both a middle school science teacher as well as a practicing neurologist. And she says because the brain loves to make predictions and it loves to get feedback on its predictions, quizzes like that are really, really nice tools. So questioning strategy number one is to use lots of quizzes because they force us to pre-plan our questions, and they're a specific way we can get kids to talk to each other. Questions are great. What's even better than really good questions is having kids flesh it out, talk to each other, elaborate, explain, clarify. Nice things happen when kids do those things. All right, and our next strategy is think time or wait time. Let's dig into this idea. Excuse me for a moment. My voice is getting a little gravelly. Sorry about that. Wait time, think time is ubiquitous. We started off the quiz by talking about Mary Budd Rowe all the way back to the 1970s, started doing research on that pause. Now, there's been some research after Mary in the 1990s by a guy named Bob Stahl out of Arizona State University. He called it think time. He took Mary Budd Rowe's original research on wait time and rather called it think time instead. Here's his rationale for that. Is the purpose of the wait is in order to get kids to think. And he elaborated it beyond the pause after the question. The original research was this: I pose a question to my audience, and then I do 1, 2, 3 Mississippi in my mind. I just wait for a moment, give them some time to think, to process, to reflect, to create an answer in their head. Then I ask for responses. Bob's research said this: yes, that's wait time one. There's also other kinds of times you can wait. Here's an example. Wait time two is when a student asks you a question. As teachers, because we're typically pretty fast-paced, I'm guilty of that, just going too fast. We're fast-paced, we're going. A student asks us a question and bam, we answer it immediately. But Bob Stahl pointed out, if you add those 3 to 5 seconds when a student asks you a question before you respond, it also gives them time to think and process. So there's a lot of different variations. I think he identified 8 different times when you can pause to cause students to think. With that as a summary, everybody knows it works. So what's stopping us? Well, let me be, let's be honest. As a profession, we all like each other. We're all family, right? What stops many of us, myself included, is sometimes I get on a roll and I just keep going so fast and I get excited about what I'm doing and I just forget. I don't mean to forget to give kids time to think. I'm going fast. Another factor I should say is that besides just forgetting to do it, some teachers struggle with wait time because it's not observable. Meaning, I'm going to pause and give you time to think, but I really don't know what's going on. I can't measure what's happening inside your head. I don't know if you're really thinking about the question or if you're thinking about something else. Because I can't measure it, I don't know it because it feels like a waste of time to some people. So those are just a couple of the factors that are stopping us. And sometimes we just forget to do it. So here are a couple of suggestions. One is to do what we call narrated wait time. If you've not heard of this strategy before, it's brilliant. It sounds something like this. Let me model it for you. Students, in just a moment, I'm going to ask you a question. After I ask that question, I'm going to pause for about 5 seconds in order to get you to think about the question. Here it is. Here's your question. What's the role of the Antarctic in weather patterns? I'm just making something up off the top of my head. What's the role of the Antarctic in weather patterns in the United States? Think about that for just a moment. In fact, everybody do this. Put your finger over your mouth like this. This is the international symbol for I'm thinking about it. We're just thinking, we're not talking yet. What's the role of the Antarctic in weather and patterns in the United States? In other words, pause the modeling. I'm narrating exactly what I'm doing and exactly what needs to happen. Instead of me just saying, students, what's the role of the Antarctic in weather and patterns in the United States? And then I just pause. Some kids are going to look at you like, What do you mean? He's not talking. Something's wrong. He's not talking. They don't know what to do with the wait time. So I narrate and I tell them, I'm going to pause for about 5 seconds after I pause the question. We're going to do one of these. Just give us time to think. You don't need to say anything until I call on you. Everybody just think about this for a moment. What is? I'm being very overt about what's supposed to happen during the 3 to 5 seconds. That's narrated wait time. I'm telling them how we're going to deal with all of that wait time so that it's a little less uncomfortable for them. When I spent years as a district level administrator in charge of professional development. We did a lot of training on questioning, and I created a poster. You can see it there on the right of that exact image. And I blew them up onto posters and I handed them out to teachers. And I said this, put it up in your classroom. That's a reminder to you that it's okay to wait. Because sometimes we just forget. Sometimes we're just going so fast and we have so much to get done, so much to cover. We get excited, we get into it, we just forget. Many teachers posted it right near their clock on their wall because you look at the clock all the time. So just post a reminder, create a poster of some sort, or a visual image of some sort for yourself. And then the last one is ask a student to tally. This is what that would look like. Pull aside a student. You have to understand students who are old enough to be able to do this, but pull aside a student and say, hey, I need your help with something. You give them a pen or a pencil and a 3x5 card. Then you teach them how to do, if they don't already, count 1 Mississippi in their head. You say, this is what's going to happen. On this card, anytime you hear me ask a question, I want you to do the 1 Mississippi thing in your mind. And you're going to write down, it's going to look something like this, question 1, and then you'll just do the picket fence kind of thing. If I waited 5 seconds, question 1, you just do a picket fence 5. That's it. If I waited 0 or less than 1, you write that down. So question 2, you could just put something like that. Really informal. This does a couple of things for us. One is you have to understand the data is going to be a little messy. It's not going to be highly accurate data because it's coming from a kid. But when that student gives feedback, so maybe on this sheet, there's a list of 10 questions that you asked, and then they're marking down about how long it's taken. And on average, you're asking 4 seconds. You can look at that data and say, I'm thinking that's pretty good. Mary Bud Rose research, 3 to 5 seconds, increased engagement. That's good. Or if they give you feedback that said, on average, you were waiting less than a second. Ask a student to tally for you and give you that data. If you're even braver than that, ask a colleague to come in and do it. If you're even super braver than that, ask your supervisor to come in and do it. Ask them to just tally, how are you doing on the wait time? So it's powerful. Questioning wait time is pretty powerful. We just have to remember to do it. We can narrate it. We can post a reminder. We can ask someone to tally that data for us. A lot of different ways to go about it. Actually, here's a bonus idea. And you'll have to, if you do this, you have to make sure that you get permission from your administrative team, but that is to record yourself. It can be as simple as getting your smartphone, opening up the voice memos feature. And when you're teaching a lesson to kids, just record it and then listen to it later just for your own personal reflection. My understanding in most states is it's perfectly legal because you're only using it for yourself. You're not trying to catch a kid being naughty. You're not, taking that audio clip and posting it all over the internet. You're just recording yourself for the purpose of analyzing how good you are, in this case, in your wait time. So recording yourself with the audio feature on your phone, really, really nice tool. Really effective tool as well. Okay, now let's jump into the next strategy. And as promised, at the end of this session, I've added some time where you can share with us some of your favorite questioning strategies as well. And that is to use both question stems and sentence starters. We did address this briefly in our last session on writing, so let's connect the dots. Briefly, let me pause, soak up the content you see on the screen, and then we'll dig into it. We did address this issue last week. For those of you who were with us last week, we talked about writing. But this is, again, how they all fit together. In this case, we're talking about how can we use those questioning strategies in order to get kids to have discussions and interact and flesh out ideas and elaborate and explain, is we plan really good questions, most of them being open-ended. With the ellipses, the ... that means kids have to kind of finish the sentence. The question stems are part of the question. Sentence starters are those things that kids could say, the specific words they might say in order to begin their response. And this, I think, was the exact one I shared during the writing webinar last week, is sometimes kids say, when you ask them to answer a question, they say, I don't know. I don't know where to start. You give them the specific words in order to begin their elaboration or their explanation. These examples are obviously probably for slightly older kids, but they work pretty well. And you can adjust them for younger kids, and you can adjust them even for older kids like college students as well. So question stems, sentence starters, great way to go, that work quite well. So, and it just forces us to be thoughtful in our planning. So I'm going to plan my questions, and then I'm going to provide students the sentence starters or the specific words to use when we begin their discussions as well, or their elaborations. So, next strategy, we'll do a bit of a deeper dive into this one. It's one of my all-time favorite strategies, called Says Who. And first of all, Says Who is a kind of a broad statement for requiring students to provide evidence, background, elaboration. It's never said in any sort of disbelief or sarcasm, but when students start answering questions, I often follow up with something like a says who, or can you tell me more? Can you elaborate? Can you give me an example? Here's why. This is what happens in many classrooms. Not all, of course, I don't want to exaggerate, but many classrooms, we do that quizzing thing where we just kind of sample kids. It looks like this. I'm standing up in front of my kids, or I'm at a small group table. I ask student number one, I call on student number one, and I ask them a question. They give me a 100% correct right answer. This is what happens. Student number one, I ask them a question. Nice job, way to go, you nailed it. Student number two, I call on them, I ask them a question. They give me a 100% correct right answer. I say, way to go, you nailed it, right on, let's keep going. Student number three, I ask them a question, and they give me a wrong answer, and in many classrooms, this is what happens. Students, let's pause and think about this for just a minute. See what I've done, student number one is right, keep going. Student number two is right, keep going. Student number three is wrong, we put the brakes on. Think about what's happening in that scenario. Student number, when we do it enough, student number three goes, oh no, I'm such a loser, I got it wrong. Because he only stops and digs when we're wrong. Rather, we're gonna flip it. No longer be satisfied with the correct answer. If you're a note taker, correct answer is what goes in there. No longer be satisfied with the correct answer. It sounds and looks like this. Student number one, I ask them a question. They give me a right answer, they're correct. And I say, thanks for that answer. I appreciate it. Thank you very much for that response. Tell me a little bit more. Elaborate for me. Why do you think that? Student number two, they also give me a correct answer, and my response is this. Thanks so much for that answer. I appreciate you taking that risk. Says who? Where did you first learn that? Why might that be true? Student number three gives me an incorrect or a wrong answer, and my response is this. Thanks so much for that answer. I appreciate the response. Tell me a little bit more and explain why you're thinking that. The response is the same. My job is to dig regardless of whether they're right or whether they're wrong. Here's why it's so important. Student number one gave me a correct answer, but they guessed. They have no idea why they're right. Student number two gave me a correct answer, but they were cheating off the person next to him. Student number three, who gave me a wrong answer, is actually closer. They probably have a better base of knowledge than student number one, who gave me a correct answer. They guess, they have no idea why they're right. They're right, but they cheated. They're quote unquote wrong, but they're closer to being right than the other two people. So my job, here's the takeaway. My job as an educator is to constantly dig, is to ask for elaboration, explanation, thoughts, clarification, examples. My job's to dig. One more note about this, then we'll go on to the next couple of strategies before we're all done, is when you do this with kids, especially if you find yourself supporting older kids who have been labeled gifted or gifted, talented, or something like that, tell them exactly what you're doing. I've worked with some kids that when they start being questioned when they're right, it destroys their world. Especially some of our high achieving gifted kids, they're just always used to being right, always used to being praised like crazy. Then all of a sudden, a teacher comes along and starts asking them for proof and evidence and elaboration and explanation. And it's unsettling for some of them. Not all of them, but it's unsettling for some of them. So I tell them this, said, my job is to dig. My job is to ask you questions to determine where you're right, where you might be slightly off, and next steps. My job is, I'm kind of like the cruise director in some cases, right? I'm like the activities director on a cruise ship. I have to decide for you, where do you go next? And I can only do that if I dig. So you give me an answer and it's right. I'm still going to ask you lots of questions. That's okay. And I model this for my students. I say this, if you give me an answer and you're pretty sure you're right, stick to your guns and we'll have a conversation. It sounds something like this. Say, Dr. Harris, I'm sure this is a correct answer. Here's why I think it. If you give me, I tell them also this, if you're not sure, say something like this. You know what? I'm not totally sure this is the right answer, but here's what I'm thinking. And we'll have a discussion. My job is to dig. One more side note about this strategy is tell parents that you're doing it as well, especially for those high achieving gifted kids, because if you make them uncomfortable in the classroom because we're constantly asking questions, even when you do it in a nice, loving, respectful manner, they're going to go home to their parents and say, Dr. Harris is always asking me these questions and I don't know why, because I'm always right. I'm always giving the right answers. And then you have to explain that to parents as well. Just tell parents this, my job is just to dig. I'm a bit of an archaeologist. As an educator, my job is to figure out where your kid is right on, where they need to be corrected, and where they need to go to next. Says who? Wonderful, brilliant strategy and works really, really well. I think we have time for 2 more strategies, then we'll open it up to the group and maybe even a bonus idea. This strategy comes from Harvey Silver and Strong, and there's one of Matthew Perini, I think was the other author on this one. They just created an acronym called QSpace. Take a look at their ways to formulate questions, and then I'll highlight just one thing for you. Take a look. So I'll be a little vulnerable with you. I think early on in my education classroom career, when it comes to questioning, I think I was rather just kind of in the box, very black and white, thinking I ask a question, the kid gives me a right answer, and then we go on. I now think a little bit differently about it, and I appreciate their model of this as well, is that questioning is a process. It's not a short chapter, open and closed. And it's the way I used to think about it. I ask a question, you give me the right answer. Good, we're ready to go. They kind of point out it's really more of an in-depth process that requires lots of planning, requires a lot of wait time and think time. It requires a lot of digging and uncovering. It requires a lot of revisiting same ideas. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because the things that you know really well in life, the things that you become an expert in, you spent a lot of time doing this kind of stuff. You not only spend a lot of time answering questions, you spend a lot of time clarifying and generalizing and making next steps and determining what ifs. You spend a lot of time doing that. Those are the things that have deepened your knowledge, why you're an expert in some things. So questioning is very much a process, and I appreciate this process that they've outlined for us as well. Really nice strategy and works quite well. And here's our last strategy before we get to sharing time and maybe even a bonus idea. And that is to use lots and lots of analogies. Analogies are beautiful tools. The brain actually loves analogies. An analogy is essentially this: take something I know, something I don't know, or something I'm learning, and helps me figure out how they're alike and how they're unlike and how they stick together. And you see a super simple analogy there on the top of the screen. And an analogy for analogies is like a hanger. It's like, where are you going to hang that idea in your closet or in your brain, in the closet of your brain? Where are you going to hang those ideas? So the more that you share analogies with kids and then ask them to explain how analogy is true, how this analogy might break down and be untrue, what makes sense about this analogy, what doesn't make sense about the analogy. If this is like this and we put them together, how is that true? How is it untrue? Analogies are brilliant tools. The brain actually loves them. They're quite sophisticated tools as well. All right, Brian, going a million miles an hour. Here are those strategies that we took a look at. Let's pause for a moment and just reflect and think and process of everything I've shared with you so far, including the 4 characteristics, those 4 characteristics. This is the 4th one, using specific strategies. What's floating around in your brain right now? Let me give you some time to just think and process. Hey, we've got time for one more bonus idea, and then we'll finish everything up. Here is that bonus idea. I stole this directly off the internet. You can see the citation there at the bottom of the screen, tailoredpractice.com. I love this one because it involves questioning and it involves kids working together. So this is what it looks. First, look at the flow chart on the screen, then I'll walk you through it and I'll tell you why I think it's so powerful. So picture the whole process. 2 students sitting shoulder to shoulder, face to face. One student maybe even has flashcards or has a series of questions. So one student asks the other, and there's the reminder, don't forget to give them time to think. They don't have to answer you within a millisecond. Ask the question and then give your partner some time to think. If they give you the right answer, it's not the end. That's the top part, the yellow box at the top. If they give you the right answer, it's not the end of the discussion. Say something like, you nailed it, that's the correct answer. Could you repeat that or rephrase that into a slightly different way? It forces them to revisit it once again. Now, the bottom flow of the flow chart, ask your partner a question, give them time to think. If they give you the wrong answer, say something like, that's okay, this is a tough one. This is something obviously I would model with kids before I expected them to do it. In other words, you encourage them, but don't discourage, you're encouraged, so that's okay. Then you give them a hint. Something like, it starts with the letter A, or this is a concept that Dr. Harris talked about yesterday at the very end of class. You give them some sort of clue or a hint. If they give you the right answer, great. Then you ask them to summarize and rephrase again. If they give you the wrong answer, you probably again say something like, that's okay, I didn't get this one the first time either. Here's the correct answer. After you give them the correct answer, you then ask them to repeat and rephrase and paraphrase again. Then you start the whole round again. I have some teachers I've worked with have taken something like this, blew it up onto a poster and put it on the wall. Some of them have printed it out onto a piece of paper and put it in front of kids so that they know the whole process. Sometimes what we do is we ask kids, hey, work together and question each other. I don't know if I necessarily really know how to do that. Some kids will like, okay, what do? We question each other, or we ask a question, what does it look like? Questioning and answering questions is a pretty sophisticated process. This helps them work through this process. I absolutely love this format. Wish I'd thought of it.